So, all right, cool, cool, cool. Uh, should I wait like another minute or so for any stragglers or anything?
No, I'd say just go for it. Yeah.
All right, awesome, awesome. So yeah, I think the plan originally I was unsure if I should just focus on teaching how to teach HTML and CSS and JavaScript or focus on Node. So I decided to kind of just combine the two. So if you guys have any questions or anything, feel free to ask. Um, we'll see how this goes. But yeah. So yeah. All right. Let me share my screen. Or actually, can I get a show of hands? Is anyone like familiar with like HTML, CSS? A little bit, very little. Okay, seems like a lot of people are very unsure about that stuff. Okay, so hopefully you guys will feel better after this. All right, so that's the plan, I guess. All right, let me share my screen. All right. All right, so I made a little short presentation. How to teach HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. All right. So uh, hopefully you guys know what all of these are. Right. HTML is a way to kind of create websites, and you use CSS to kind of add to it, either like stylizing it or making however way you want it to look. And JavaScript is just JavaScript, which is a whole nother thing that is probably as confusing and as complicated as it can be. But yes. So what I like to do, and now this kind of can be however way you want to present it, but usually when I'm teaching like a student the concepts of what HTML, CSS, and JavaScript are, I like to use this metaphor. And I'm pretty sure like Jimmy has noticed this, and like anyone else who I've worked with on like the WebRocks camps. But I really like to use this metaphor of a house. So what HTML is the structure of the house. It's the foundation, the walls, the actual structure of a way of a website is. CSS is the way that the house looks, the style, the way that everything's positioned, the colors, all of that. And now JavaScript is the working parts, the electricity, the heating, the plumbing, the moving parts of a website. Now, this usually helps kids focus and understand what these different things are. But because when working with websites with kids, they tend to kind of get very confused with syntax between all the three and figuring out, oh, which one's which. So I always like to refer to this to kind of focus in their like concentration onto like which is which. All right. So yeah, that's kind of like the beginning of this, and how like I usually introduce people who are completely new to like whoever wants to like make a website. Oops. Okay, so I'm gonna just this is basically all you really need to know about HTML. Is HTML is composed of elements. Now, since most people have seen it before, breaking down the structure of an element is very important. Uh, this image literally just shows what an HTML element is. You have a starting tag, some content depending on the element, and an end tag also depending on the element. But you can also have attributes as well as attribute values for elements. All right. So usually when teaching, I think it's important to kind of not talk too much about complicated elements, because in HTML, especially in HTML5, there's a lot of specific HTML elements. So when teaching kids, I usually don't show them all these different elements, right? Because then they'll get too complicated or too confused at which one's which and stuff. So I like to kind of just generalize the way that elements are and the structure of the elements. All right. Here are kind of like a list of the like basic HTMLs elements that I like to use and to cover. The important ones for sure are HTML head and body. Uh, for those who don't know, the HTML element is basically the initial one. That's saying all of this that's in between the tags is part of the HTML. The head element is saying all the like settings of like your website. Usually it has like the title uh, as well as links to CSS and all of that. And body is usually the place where all the content of the website is located. And then all these other ones are just kind of used for other purposes of whatever it is that you want. Um, Now, you may have noticed I written semantic HTML. Does anyone know what semantic HTML is?
That was totally my question, Eddie. I was like, I never know how to explain semantic.
Yeah. So semantic is definitely a more complicated thing to cover with kids. And typically I usually don't, depending on the level of their like understanding of HTML. But what semantic HTML is using specific elements for specific purposes. So, for instance, using a P element for paragraphs, using an H1 for a heading, using what it's specifically made for that purpose. Now, if you like go on to like a website, probably pretty much most websites, you'll notice that they're composed of like probably just divs, right? And I can kind of possibly look into uh, an example of that. So, for instance, if I go to like Google, right, and I like inspect the website, and I can actually see the like actual HTML. Here, you'll notice that there's actually a lot of divs. Uh, a lot of, from what I've noticed, a lot of developers tend to just use divs as like a basic element that just has a that is just like a container, and you just add either IDs or classes to change the structure or the shape of the element to whatever fits their needs. But when using semantic HTML, you use the specific purpose of the elements for what they're used for. Now, the reason why I want to bring this up is that because this can introduce you to like talking about semantic HTML. And this can lead to like a tech conversation about what is semantic HTML, what it's used for. Now, some people might say like, oh, it's kind of pointless. I can just create a div that does the same thing as like a paragraph tag, right? Or I could just structure this however it is that I want. But I think the main purpose of like semantic HTML actually lies with screen readers. So for those who don't know, screen readers are used for people who can't traverse like websites as easily as viewing the website. So typically it's usually used by people who can't read well or those who are blind, and they have a screen reader that tells them how the website and the HTML is structured. And using semantic HTML, the readers understand what the elements are so that the screen reader can interpret that and tell the person what the use is. And I think that's probably one of the like most important reasons why. But for kids, they probably don't understand the concept of that or really understand that. So it depends on, again, the level of their understanding. But I think that'd be kind of like a cool conversation for sure to like open up to kids about too, is talking about semantic HTML. Yeah, Jimmy.
Um, do you like the way that you listed it here? Is that generally like the order that you follow in terms of like how you introduce it to students? Like, First I talk about HTML, then I talk about head, then body, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. And now this list is not like a definitive list of exactly how it is. I think it depends on like a student by student basis, because sometimes you'll have students who are like, all right, I know exactly what I want to do. I just want to have a bunch of images, or I want to like type out all of this stuff. I want to make this website. But then some people might be like, I don't know what I want to do. So with those types of students, this is kind of like the structure that I kind of go through, explaining HTML, head, body for sure. Those are like the main three you should cover first, and then slowly ease them into other elements as well. P tags are pretty straightforward. Oh, I also forgot. I should probably uh, also include H1s all the way to H6s. Headings. Those are used for like titles and stuff. But yeah, then I would go into like paragraph, because those are the text ones. Those are easier to kind of visually and instantly see on the screen when you're going through like a website. Uh, and then students really love having links to things. So A tags are another like thing that'll catch their attention as well. And then when we get to like images and iframes, that's like the, ooh, this is the really interesting part. I can put images or I could put videos and stuff on my website. Um, uh, Getting into these elements for sure. Um, that's kind of when you want to talk about like IDs and classes, or not actually. This is where you actually want to talk about attributes, because with image elements, they have an attribute of src, which is a source. So, for instance, if you have an image that has an image element, it needs to have a source of what to actually display. So that's why I kind of go through these first ones first, because they don't necessarily need to know what an attribute is right away. But if they want to do like images or iframes, then they for sure need to know what a attribute is. All right. Uh, yeah. And I think I probably jumped the gun a little bit to kind of like not go over some code and stuff. So I'll just jump right in and kind of show a little bit of like code. So if everyone is hopefully familiar with REPL, that's kind of like the platform I like to use. One, because it makes creating a website very easy. You don't have to like go through and have local files and stuff like that. Everything's just on REPL, and they give you kind of a nice starter kit with a basic HTML file, JavaScript, and CSS file. It's all linked, and you don't have to worry about that. So I like using REPL because it does all this for you, right? So like typically, I would kind of just like go through the code line by line, telling about elements. Sometimes I probably will skip some elements like these meta elements and title, link, and even the script, just because those are not as important right away to understand. So typically I just say, okay, let's just start typing. And here I can create an H1 element that says hello, right? Make sure I have my closing tag, and I can instantly see what my website looks like. All right, that's another plus for REPL, is I can instantly see what it is. All right, so that's HTML for you. Um, Very simple stuff. Um, does anyone have any questions about like HTML specifically? And I found this, and this kind of perfectly explains semantic HTML, because obviously you want to have meaning behind your elements, but people just are like, I could just use divs. So I think this is a good image to kind of show students what semantic HTML is also. But yeah, but yeah, that's a general gist of HTML. And now I'll probably jump right into the more confusing part that probably everyone will agree with, and I agree with you as well: CSS. Now, I could probably talk a lot about CSS because there's way too much to talk about. So I'm only going to say the general basics of it. And this is the general basics of it. there are three main parts to CSS. You need to have a selector, a property, and some type of value. And that's basically all you need for CSS. When it comes to selectors, uh, especially when teaching, you probably want to start off with element selectors. Now, um, I don't know everyone's level of understanding of CSS, so I'll kind of like explain um, the different things about selectors. You can actually have a variety of selectors when selecting different parts of your HTML. So usually you start off with an element selector because the students will typically have something on their website like this and be like, hey, I want to kind of make this not look as boring. So I notice a lot, especially when students want to make a website, that they jump right into learning HTML, but they immediately want to just make it look pretty. They either want to make it look a certain way, or they want to just want something better to look at. So typically, I would say, okay, let's jump right into CSS and kind of uh, either uh, focus on HTML and then CSS, or depending on the student, kind of jump between the two. So, for instance, oh, I just taught them what an H1 is, right? Now I can kind of show them how to incorporate that in CSS, right? And based off the slides, the main parts, we need a selector. So now the selector means, oh, I'm getting ahead of myself. A selector here is uh, typically just an element name, right? So going back to like the HTML, we go by the element name, right? So this element right here, it typically you would refer to it as an H1 element, right? So as a selector, I would put H1 right here and then curly brackets. Now, anything inside here will reflect on every H1 element that is inside my HTML. So if I were to do color green, changes the color to green. Now, especially with some of my students, because I have a range of students who are like either very new to HTML or very much know what they want to do. It can be kind of hard to kind of gauge what it is that they want. A lot of students are like, oh, I know exactly what I want, right? And they're like, I want to put this over here. I want to shape it this way. Those are the students I like to say are the students that I'm going to do a scavenger hunt with, because most of the time I don't know the answer of that right away, because it's a very specific, not very general way to change something on their website. So that's when I scavenger hunt and try to find the answer myself. Oh, how do I reverse text or something? Whatever like random thing that they want their website to be. That tends to be the hardest when teaching kids. But most of the time, it's uh, once we get a result of some sort, they actually show a lot of like positivity and be like, yes, this is exactly what I want. Or it may not be exactly what I want, but this will do for now. For students who are like, who have no idea what they want to do or unsure about this, it's good to kind of just start off with like basic properties. And now here, I used color. Color is a property that changes the font color, as you can see. I'm not going to go over every single property because there are quite a lot of properties to go over, and I'm pretty sure, literally, I could probably just talk an hour straight about properties, and that'll just be boring. But just know there's a lot of things that we can do. I can. Another good thing I like about REPL is if you start typing something, it'll actually show you all the different properties at your disposal, right? So here, if I even just type in T, these are all the properties associated to my selector. In this case, an H1. So yes, there's a lot to know, but just know that these are some things that you can kind of play around with. Another one I like to use is like text align. Uh, one mostly because students don't like all their text all the way to the left side, so that's always kind of fun to kind of just play around with too. Uh, yeah, yeah. Any questions so far? I know I feel like I'm just like rambling and stuff, but yeah. Any questions so far? Okay, and yeah, feel free to just interrupt me if like it's confusing, or like if you like want to add something also, definitely feel free. And yeah. So the next thing that I wanted to go over is uh, when it comes to CSS, it's good to know classes and IDs. So uh, classes are basically short for classification. They are used to kind of um, describe what an element's classification is, what its purpose is. And it's the same thing for an ID, except a class can be a more general purpose use. So again, when teaching students the concepts of classes and IDs, this can get a little confusing. One for students who like may have already learned like what a class is in another language, this concept definitely confuses them because they're very much geared of like, oh, Python, I know what a class is. It's like creating an object of some sort or whatever. Whereas here, it's more of a classification. So what I find useful for students who already understand the concept of class in coding in another context, instead of just saying class, I would say classification. And then that just makes it a little easier for them to understand. For everyone else, class is totally fine. Yes. So uh, when it comes to classes and IDs, usually I like to kind of introduce those concepts early on into teaching CSS. So when they want to kind of make their website look a little pretty, maybe they want to do a certain features on certain things, right? Most of the time, they want to have repeated styles to different things. For instance, if I were to create another element that had, um, oh, oh, do they do this? Yes, they do. Another thing that Ripple does is that you can type in lorem and press tab, and it gives you a lorem text. So for instance, if I have text here, all right, it looks a certain way, right? And for instance, what if I wanted to have all my text to be the same color, for instance? Well, there's various ways I can do this. Uh, knowing what your student wants will definitely help you kind of lean towards which direction of like what part of CSS or HTML you want to teach. I think that's definitely an important part too. So in the case of like here, if they want to kind of make something the same, I would definitely introduce class. Even though you could probably do this without using classes, this is a good way to show what a class is. So that way um, they know what a class is early on so that they can always remember that. I think for sure classes and IDs are definitely important to teach early on, even if they don't use them as much, just so that they are aware that those exist and definitely repeatedly telling them what it is. So here, I would tell them, all right, let's kind of one. I would first tell them what would they do. You know, typically 9 times out of 10, they would probably be like, okay, I need a P selector and I need to change its color to green. And now this definitely gets the job done, changes everything to green. But the more that they add, the more that they have to go back to their CSS, add another selector, and so on. And it gets very repetitive. And now some students actually might enjoy that, and that's totally fine. But I also want to like show them the option of, hey, why don't we use a class? Now, typically I would say like what a class is, the purpose of that, and then go into the CSS. Typically, classes start with, or in CSS, classes start with a dot, and here you can give it a specific name. Um, Another way that I kind of describe classes and IDs is I kind of say that they're like variables. So for students who have worked in other coding languages, even Scratch, for instance, they hopefully will understand the idea of a variable. So comparing them to a variable makes it easier for them to understand the naming convention of it, right? Because when it comes to classes and IDs, you can name them whatever it is you want. I can call this potato if I really wanted. But generally, you want to call them something that for what it does, right? So in this case, I just have a class that's green that literally just changes the color to green, right? And now if I remove all of this from my other elements, all my text is now not green anymore. So then we would go into our HTML and introduce them to how to apply it. So now this definitely is another concept or another thing that I noticed with a lot of students is that sometimes students would want to put their class right here inside of the elements. Um, I think if something like this were to happen, or if like they're unsure of where to put this class, I would definitely go over attributes again. Again, going back to the HTML structure, attributes is an important part. Mostly dealing with CSS, at least the early stages of creating a website. Later on, it can be used for other purposes as well. But in this term, yeah, Jimmy.
I always struggle with like what to call the Pac-Man mouths. It's open angle bracket, is that right? Or like, you know how you say like, can you put it inside the bracket? Or like, how do you usually call them that students respond and go, oh yeah, that's what it is.
Yeah, yeah. So initially, what I would say is I would say from the opening tag, and so usually I think another thing I've noticed too is if I'm consistent with my language and my terminology, they eventually start picking it up. At first they're going to be like, what's an opening tag again? And you just have to keep on reinforcing what an opening tag is compared to what a closing tag is, what even a tag is for an element, right? Because those are the kind of like terminologies that are very confusing, right? An element is the entirety of the tag, the content, and the other tag. And now I think I'm also at fault here too. Sometimes I interchange a tag and an element, um, but I feel like, and I think I could probably work on that too. But for the most part, you want to be consistent with your terminology. Always make sure you say to place your attributes inside of the opening tag. I would definitely start off with that. And if it gets to the line of like, oh, I don't know what an opening tag is, then I would probably say like greater than, less than symbols. Or sometimes I think some of my students have also said like the like arrows, even though they're like not necessarily arrows, but like it really depends on like what really catches on with them. But I think that's probably also a case by case basis. But yes, awesome. So yeah, going in here, make sure we go inside of the opening tag, and then here we would give a attribute name. So now there are a bunch of attributes that are already kind of created for us. As you can see, there are, and again, REPL does the thing where you uh, can see all the attributes that have been already implemented. But we're not going to get too in depth of those because uh, early on, especially just with making a website, you don't really need to know what those are. And you're only going to focus mostly on class IDs and other things, especially in JavaScript, which we'll get to in a little bit. So yeah, here I can just give it a class of green, and it will change the paragraph to having all the style of the class green. And then I can do the same thing for my H1. Give it a class of green. And there we go. And it changes everything to green. And now anytime they add another element that they want to have the color green, they can just add the class green. And now another thing I also wanted to mention is that especially when it comes to class and ID names, the convention is to not have spaces. The reason for that is because an element can have multiple classes. For instance, if I wanted the font size to be a certain size, right? Let's say if I wanted a class of small, that changes the font size to, let's say, 8 pixels, right? And let's say I have another paragraph. And let's say I only want to change only one of them to have small text. Sometimes I'll notice that students will want to do this, where they create another attribute tag or another attribute and say small like this. Now, this doesn't necessarily work, as you can see. So the way that classes work is that you can actually just put it in the same line, just separated by a space. So here I could just say green small, and it'll apply that here. Right? So yeah, most of the time, also, it's probably easier to deal with classes than IDs.
Do you know, Eddie, if there's a conflict the in like the styles, like if small was by default red, do you know which would take priority?
So yes, so the way that it works is that I think it applies in the way that the file is structured. So for instance, if I were to do that example and we try running it, it's red. The reason why it's red is because this selector comes after green.
Gotcha.
So here, if I were to switch it up and move it up here, you'll notice that the text is now green.
Oh, okay. So it's the order in the CSS file, not in the
Exactly.
not in the element itself. Okay, cool.
Exactly. Because I think the way that it actually is executed is that it identifies the classes and then goes into the style and goes through the file until it finds one and then applies the style.
Yeah,
So
interesting.
the order in your CSS file actually kind of matters in terms of this.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks.
Yes. And yeah, that'll probably be a problem, especially when dealing with CSS problems. That's definitely a very tricky thing. You'll notice a lot about especially when making websites, there'll be problems that you're like, I have no idea how to fix this. It could be like a CSS problem or it's an HTML problem. Most of the time, it's you just having to get used to all these different errors that happen. So I've worked with a lot of kids with teaching them how to create a website. I've come to a lot of problems where they are like, oh, my style doesn't apply. I've noticed sometimes they may forget a closing tag for one of their elements, right? And if this had a different class than the other ones, the style would apply to everything else, right? So for instance, if I change this so that the small should only apply to the first paragraph, we'll notice that it actually doesn't. Oh, because the closing one is here. Interesting. Well, this is not a good example, but there are some times where the style will affect all the other elements. And most of the time, it's probably either like a closing tag or a tag thing in terms of HTML. Or in the CSS, another problem I notice is that people forget to have semicolons at the end of each line. So here, if I were to do like the color red, it actually won't run and it won't change the color red. And the good thing about REPL also is that it actually shows you that there's an error. So hopefully that doesn't happen, but kids will probably not notice that because they're probably too focused on their website, and they probably won't notice the error. And even if they see the error, they see that the error is on this line. So this is another concept I like to introduce, is trying to get them to figure out what the error is. Uh, I think definitely having kids recognize that errors may not be on the exact line that it shows, but seeing around the error definitely helps. And that'll cause a lot of error fixes down the line for sure. Because if you tend to like do them or show them, they'll probably continuously make the same mistakes over and over again. So I definitely like to let them figure it out themselves and help them guide it by like asking questions and like saying, okay, if the error is not on this line, what else can it be? You know, kind of making them come to the realization so that they can understand it. And eventually they'll recognize those problems so that the next time that it happens, which most of the times it probably will happen again, they'll recognize it and fix it immediately or fix it faster than at least last time. So yeah, CSS, and that's just the introduction to CSS. I haven't talked about different elements and kind of like the way that they work. Um, Depending on the skill level and the complexity of a student's website, sometimes we'll just create a website like this where it's just like, oh, a bunch of content that they want to display, possibly adding more pages and incorporating A tags to link between them, change like background images. Those are like the very basic stuff that we can do. Sometimes if they are very complex ideas, like moving around specific parts, changing the spacing between different things, that gets into the more intermediate level of like teaching how to create a website. And if that ever happens, I like to show them the inspect mode. Um, I'm not sure about last time, but I think what was it? Noah had a lesson on how to go inside here too. So some of you might already know how to do this, but this definitely is super interesting to kids. They think they're hackers. They are like so like, oh, this is so cool. I can actually see what the code is. And especially after going through like what elements are, what CSS is, they'll be like, oh, this is so cool. So this is definitely a for sure thing that you should probably show your kids and stuff if they're making a website. But what I like to introduce is this thing at the very bottom. So when you go into the elements tab, you'll see the HTML, and then at the bottom is your styles. But if you go past that, a lot of people miss this giant box here. And now this box may not be as important right away, but it's important to those who want to deal with spacing. And it's called the, I think it's called the box model. Each element is actually composed of basically 4 different parts: something called the margin, border, padding, and the content. So here, if I were to kind of select, so if I were to select this image, here I can look at the box model for this image and notice that, let me increase this a little bit, and notice that there's nothing for the margin, nothing for the border. But if I were to see the padding and even hover over the padding, it says that there's 109 pixels in the padding. So I would recommend to introduce this concept relatively early on. it's definitely a more complex concept to teach, especially because I'm sure most people probably don't know this also, but this definitely helps with spacing issues. So now let me kind of explain what each of these things are. Margin is the space outside of the border. The border is, as you can tell, the border of the element. And padding is the space between the border and the contents. And then the thing in the middle is just the content of what it actually is. All right. So here we can even see like probably some other elements, like for instance, this one right here. We can see that this has margin. And the cool thing I like about this also is that it's very color coded. You can see that this is margin and not padding. Um, and another thing on top of this, once you kind of show this, you'll start to notice that certain elements uh, doesn't really follow along with this box model. And that's another thing that I like to introduce, and that's ta- telling or talking about the display style of elements. Um, here, so I talked about semantic HTML. Another purpose that semantic HTML has that is not necessarily as important to know, but they already have default style associated to them. H1s have are bolded and have a certain text size. Paragraphs have a certain text size and some margin, top margin and bottom margin, which explains this space right here. They also have specific display styles as well. So if I were to say display, there are different displays that we can do. Now, I don't want to get too complicated because one, I've talked probably way too much about CSS, and I'm going to probably move on after this and head into JavaScript. But displays kind of change the way that an HTML is structured. Now, this is where I would introduce what block elements are. The main ones you probably want to go over are block and inline elements. So block elements are essentially elements that try to take up as much space as they can. They try to fill as much space as they can. So by default, H1s are block elements. Paragraphs are block elements. Now, if I were to go to my website and inspect this, we can kind of see, can see how this block element works. So if I were to get on my H1, here you can see that blue color. So typically students would see, or if you were to like let them guess like, oh, what's the content of this element? They'll probably most of the time just say, oh, just the word. But because of block elements try to take up as much space as they can, the actual content extends past the actual content that you see. Now, the way that this works is that because block elements take as much space, block elements cannot be side by side. So that introduces the concept of inline block. But before I talk about inline blocks, I'll talk about inline elements. Inline elements are elements that take up as much as they need, no more and no less. Those are what you'll see as A tags, image elements, spans. Those are your typical inline elements. Now, inline block elements are kind of like a hybrid between the two. They function like a block element, but have the features of an inline element where we can actually put them next to each other and actually say the sizing of everything. So now, also another thing is inline elements, you cannot change the size of the element. Whereas in block elements, you can change the size. So when I say size, I mean like width or height or other sizing kind of properties that we can change. For span elements, if you were to change the property, it actually won't apply because they are inline elements. It won't be until you change them to like block element or inline block where it actually will apply. Yes. So yeah, that's like definitely a more advanced topic for CSS that I probably won't introduce until they're more comfortable with classes, IDs, and even the box model. But that self is kind of an interesting concept. All right. So now I'm going to talk about JavaScript, and now I'm going to kind of go over this fairly quickly because I do want to talk a little bit about Node.js, just a little bit. But yes, when it comes to JavaScript, especially dealing with websites, the only thing you really need to know is what the DOM is. So now the DOM is just a document object model. If you really want to go in depth about what the DOM is, you can kind of show them the inspect element and it kind of show them what the DOM structure actually is. But typically, what you would want to do with JavaScript, especially with a website, is usually you would want to do something like document dot get element by ID. This is most of the time your bread and butter for introductory stuff for JavaScript, for knowing what JavaScript is on a website. And if someone wants to do something on their website, like for instance, change certain numbers on certain clicks or have some sort of functionality, this is your bread and butter. Bread and butter. Bread and butter. Oh my gosh. And then if at some point I haven't introduced IDs yet, this is also another good opportunity to introduce what IDs are. There is another thing you can use. You can also do by class name as well. But what this actually returns is an array. And now, most of the time, not all the time, students who are at this level may not understand what an array is. So having to go through an array itself, it tends to be a very difficult task. So most of the time, I stick with going by IDs, since this just gives you one element that has a specific ID. So the way I like to describe it is, one, you have to give an ID, just like the same way you would a class. And again, you can name it whatever you want. And in your JavaScript, all you have to do is just pass in the same ID value. And now here, you would just say h1, and it's the actual element. So the way that I like to kind of explain JavaScript like this is the variable here that you're setting is actually setting it to the actual element. And you can apply certain things to this element. For instance, I can do h1 dot, and you'll notice here are different things that I can access from this specific element that I have gotten. Most of the time, you can either change their class, which adds some functionality. Another thing is you could probably change their style, which is definitely something that's the most interesting part, where you can say dot style, and you can change their styles here. So now here you can actually apply some CSS concept that you probably already know. In this case, these are all the properties you can apply. So for instance, I can do CSS.style.color equals blue in this case. And if I try running it, it changes it to blue because of this line right here. So this is another way we can apply styles and other stuff as well in here. Just know that you don't necessarily need to know JavaScript to do these simple things. One thing that you probably do need to know is that when declaring variables, you'd want to either say var or let to actually declare the variable. Most of the time I just stick with var, though I think the common practice nowadays is using let. That's a whole nother conversation I could probably go into, but just for simplicity's sake, it clicks with students with var because they already know what variables are. So they're like, oh, var, variable. that's usually what I stick with. So that clicks with them easier. Um, if statements are pretty much the same in any other coding language, if you're familiar with Java, syntactically it's fairly similar. You'll also notice that lines don't necessarily have to end in a semicolon, though typically you should. But JavaScript is more lenient when it comes to semicolons than Java is. Yes, so that's my short talk about JavaScript. I do want to talk about Node.js. One, because REPL is very nice when it comes to Node.js. So does anyone know what Node.js is? Or is everyone completely unaware of what it is? Okay, so I'm going to try to explain what Node.js in the simplest way I can. Uh, and now this is kind of what I found on Node.js, and this is a very brief but like to the point explanation of what Node.js is. If it can load up properly. Basically, it's a server-side JavaScript application that can do lots of things. Um, Typically, if a student is interested in kind of um, saving some type of database uh, thing or keeping track of a lot of things, that would be a more advanced topic. And then that would be a good introduction to Node.js. So now, at this point, I would recommend only introducing students to Node.js if they're comfortable with JavaScript. And uh, I say comfortable very leniently because JavaScript can be a very weird language. At least familiar with what objects are in JavaScript, basic statements, functions, all the typical stuff you need to know in any other coding language, really. But yes, when it comes to Node.js, it's actually very easy to use it in REPL. REPL, because you can actually just create a project that's literally just in Node.js. It's that easy. The problem with that, though, is it doesn't show you a template of anything. It just pops you in with an index.js file with nothing in it, and that's it. So starting it is probably the roughest part. So the thing about Node.js is that at least the thing that I really like about Node.js is you can use what's called different modules. You can grab like pre-built modules of code and kind of use it to your advantage. Some of you might be familiar with like Express, React. There are all these other Angular, other like JavaScript libraries that you can apply using Node.js. So for instance, here, I use the modules Express and EJS. Um, Mostly because these are probably the simplest ones to use. You can also, instead of using Express, you could probably use HTTPS instead to start up a server that actually runs their website. But this is kind of like the basic Node.js structure I usually go through with my students. Um, Typically setting a view engine. This just says what am I trying to render? Um, I typically go with EJS because it's embedded JavaScript. Um, it's basically HTML that you can embed JavaScript into. And it's actually fairly simple and very easy to use. Um, some other stuff we kind of have to use is this URL encoded. I forget exactly why I need to use this. I think it just makes things run properly. I can't think off the top of my head. This line just lets you use the public folder, which you can apply your local CSS file, your local JavaScript files, and maybe other assets that you have. And then here you just start up your server at a specific location. Typically, you can say like 3,000 or 8,000. I forget exactly what the practice is, but here you start up a server. And then here is kind of like the routes to that server. Now, I don't know if everyone's too familiar with HTTPS, but different routes to a server. And now this is definitely a way more advanced topic to go into that maybe I can go into another time. But this is kind of like the basic layout of like a simple website for a more advanced student who's already bored with JavaScript, CSS, and HTML. And this can introduce them to how like the internet works, how I can need to go to a specific route or a specific request that I'm trying to get. And what do I do with that request? Um, and yeah, for those who are interested in seeing what the index.egs file looks just like a typical HTML page. Um, the cool thing is I believe you can have a, I forget exactly the syntax, but if you do like curly brackets, you can actually just put direct JavaScript in here, in which case you can apply that to maybe you want to display a variable from something or another. But yeah, this is why I like EJS, because you don't have to learn a whole nother like syntax. You're just basically using HTML. And yeah, I know I feel like this last part was definitely a little rushed, but does anyone have any questions or maybe want to look at anything else? But yeah. Yes, Jamie.
So when students want to learn Node, or like,
Mhm.
what are some like common like first requests from students of like, oh, I want to make an app that does this, or I want to make a website that does this. Like, yeah, what are some of those first kind of projects that students ask for?
Mm. So typically, at least I like from my experience, is it's using the same concepts. They're not necessarily any like larger ideas or projects, but um, ones that are, for instance, I had a student who wanted to create a website where you sign in and you basically log your favorites of different things, whether it's like your color, your game, your food, just favorites. So that in and itself made me want to introduce them to Node.js because one, you're able to go to different routes with different paths, and even have like some sort of database, which I know REPL has a database feature, but I actually am not too familiar with that. But that's something I need to play around with. But typically, I if it's like a typical like website that's just on a larger scale, that's another thing too. Like if they have different um, pages, for instance, that would be like another introduction to kind of like, oh, you can have different routes that can introduce them to the concept of like how how you go to like google.com/something, what those uh, routes mean essentially. But yeah, most of the time though, it's mostly students who have like heard of Node.js or have heard of like React or something, some sort of library that wants them to know that. I will say those students tend to want to download Node.js and have it directly on the computer. That process can be difficult depending on their system. Uh, Most of the time, though, it's easier to just run it off of REPL. But so, and I find it that like installation process usually takes like a whole session or like an hour to like finish, uh, which by the end of the session they're just like, oh, I never did anything. I just got the installation. So I tend to just let's go on REPL to kind of have that immediate like satisfaction of boom, I can see something on the screen, right? I have something there. But if they're very like gung ho and like for sure want to have it on their local computer, then we'll just go through the installation process. But yeah, any other questions or anything else?
Yeah, I had a quick question.
Yeah.
What are some resources or like tutorials that you would recommend for learning Node.js? Like say we wanted to experiment with it on our own time.
Yes. So actually, the actual Node.js website is very good in learning Node.js. They actually give you like a history of Node.js if you want to know like the like backstory of Node.js for sure. This is definitely something I would go through. This definitely goes more in depth than you probably need to actually teach it. But if it's something that's super interested in you, this explains so much. Um, other resources that I also had in mind when just teaching in general, W3 schools. Um, this is like the go-to website, especially for CSS, uh, to just understand different properties, different attributes, explaining HTML. And I'm pretty sure they also have a Node.js section as well. So that could be also another a resource as well. This one's not nearly as detailed as the Node.js website. So this one is the one you probably want to go to first to kind of just like dip your hand in to see how it is. And it's probably more palpable than the actual Node.js website. But yes, W3 Schools is like my go-to website, especially when students ask about like, oh, how do I change this color or do this property or this element? W3 Schools is definitely a go-to. Mozilla also has a good section on like CSS and other HTML stuff. That's another thing I'd go to. Um, Also, another thing I've noticed too, if students are more of like the type to kind of go lesson by lesson structure, I like to use Code Academy. They basically have like lessons that you kind of guide through them to kind of have like a final thing on like a website. They have different lessons on HTML and CSS. They also have more complex ones, which I think may be premium lessons. I'm not too sure on those though, but I do like using Code Academy. And other things that did want to mention is I actually use some extensions that definitely help. One I like to use is Color Picker. A lot of the time, students might find like colors on a website, for instance, like Google, right? If I were to try to figure out, oh, I like this color blue, right? Well, I could just use this extension to actually select the actual color on the website and hover over it. And it'll actually tell me the RGB value of that color. And you can use that to apply it to your website or wherever it is you want. Um, Another one I like to use is something called pesticide. This one may not be as important, but just clicking on it immediately shows you the structure of the HTML. It's not as important, but it's helpful to kind of see the structure of like the HTML. This one may not be as needed as you can easily just go to inspect and visually see it yourself. But if you want like an instant visual, pesticide is a good extension, and it's a toggleable too. And then last but not least is this one right here. This one I actually just found out recently. It's called Fonts Ninja. Uh, Another thing is you can actually look on. Let's see, where is it? Oh no. Yeah, if you like have it and hover over. Oh, that's not a good example. Let's see. What has yeah, if I go to like let's say the Coder School website, for instance, right? There's like font on here, right? And I want to know, oh, what is the font that they're using? Well, I can use this extension and hover over the different elements. And not only will it tell me what font it is, it'll also tell me the font size, the different spacing, as well as the color. So this extension is very useful for like students who are like, oh, I want to have this font, and it might be hard to figure out what that font is. This makes it very easy. So yeah, you can just hover over all the different like text, and it'll show you like what the font is and all of that stuff. But yeah, those are like kind of like my go-to resources if you like really interested in. I actually use Fonts Ninja to kind of use the font on here to match the Coder School. So yeah, but yeah. Any other questions or anything? And I can also post up this slide so you can like link to the different things as well as looking back on this. So I'll post it in the Discord as well. Yeah. Any other questions or anything? All right. Awesome. Well, I guess that'll be it then. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Eddie.
Everyone.
Yeah,
Yeah,
thanks.
no problem.
Thanks, Eddie.